7/7/1401 سراغ از سلویه کارگرها دست به اعتصاب زدن و جاده‌ها اتوبان بستنه.
دختر جوانی در گذشت، خب حادثه تلخی بود، دل ما هم سوخت. کی این برنامه ریزی رو کرده؟ بنده به صراحت میگم این برنامه ریزی کار آمریکا، کار رژیم غاصب و جعلی صهیونیستی و
Welcome, comrades, to our session tonight of Red Line TV, where we're looking at the situation in Iran. It's really, for us as socialists on Red Line TV, we are internationalists. We understand that the struggle of workers and students in Iran or in Yemen or in the USA is our struggle. We have much more in common with the students and the workers on the streets than we have with our own ruling class. And we understand that socialism has to be international, otherwise it turns into its opposite, as the example of the Soviet Union shows. So looking at the situation in Iran is, for us, is not some kind of abstract exercise. These are our brothers and sisters, and we should discuss how we can support them. For us, it does not mean we support the intervention of the US or Western imperialism because they claim to be supportive of these protests. Also, on the other hand, we do not support the theocracy in Iran. Just because it is the enemy of the US does not mean it is our friend. There are obviously different views on these issues on the left and beyond, and we want to discuss them tonight. And we're very, very pleased to welcome as our first speaker Nasrin Parvaz, who's a women's and civil rights activist, and she was arrested and tortured and sentenced to death in Iran in 1982. Her sentence was commuted to 10 years imprisonment, and she was released in 1990. She fled to England and claimed asylum in 1993, and she's written a number of books on her experience. Welcome, Nasrin. Thanks for joining us. We thought it'd be good to start with you to update us a little bit on the protests as you see it. I believe you are in contact with people in Iran as well.
Yes, thank you. Women started the current movement after the killing of Mahsa Amini by the morality police, and men supported them. It started with slogans and acts against the hijab, but soon it turned into mass demonstrations against the regime. In a country that the regime tried for 43 years to convince the population that women are inferior to men, the main slogan is women, life, freedom. Women issues in Iran isn't only hijab. It includes every aspect of life, from marriage to divorce to custody of children, inheritance, and so many other things. Just to name one, girls' inheritance is half boys. The protests have spread through the entire country, and it includes people of different socioeconomic background. The regime has raided universities and schools and arrested students. They broke hands and legs of students in Sharif University before arresting them. Last Monday, 8,000 workers, which you show in Asaluye, one of the oil refineries in the south, started a strike and asked people to stop going to work. Soon, 8,000 workers in another oil refineries in the south and other workers joined the strike. Hundreds of workers are arrested. It has been a week now since shops and most shops in most of towns in Kurdistan have closed, and shops in other towns are also closing to show solidarity with the protests. The regime is calling the shop owners and telling them they'll be arrested if they don't open their shops, but they won't listen. On Friday, 14th October, people published names of 34 children who were killed by the regime during the current protest. There was a massive fire and a loud explosion at Evin prison on Saturday night. A prisoner could call his family yesterday and said about 9 p.m. Saturday night, the guards started shooting at prisoners and beat on their head with batons. He added the guards threw grenade and tear gas into the wing, then took away about 50 prisoners after beating them severely. He said while hitting on prisoners' head, the warden of the Evin shouted at them, I'll kill you all. Mehdi Hashemi Rafsanjani, the son of the late president who was on leave from Evin prison, was told to stay out for now. He was supposed to return on Friday. This suggests that the fire and loud explosion was intentional. We don't have an exact number of prisoners who were killed or were injured, but the Iranian state media said, first it said 40 prisoners died from smoke inhalation and 61 were injured in Evin prison fire. Then it corrected herself and said 4 prisoners were killed from smoke. Usually, women prisoners have visits with their families on Sundays, but none of them had visits yesterday. Talking about prison, in 1988, I was in prison when the regime massacred thousands of prisoners. I wonder if the socialists said anything about it. The regime claimed we were the Western government's spies and deserved death. The regime says the same thing about the protesters arresting now. Did socialists ever support any of people's movements during the Islamic regime? Or did socialists ever condemn the Islamic regime for suppressing people in Iran, or when it assassinated dissidents in Iran or in Europe? I wonder what kind of movement in a country like Iran would attract socialists in the West as something worth fighting for. What did the socialists do when the Western governments crushed people in Afghanistan, especially women with their bombs or with Taliban? What about when the Islamists were West's alternative to Shah's regime for two reasons? That people in Iran didn't want Shah anymore, and the Shah wanted more than what the Western governments were already paying him for the Iranian oils, from the Iranian oil's profit. A revolution is taking place in Iran, and there isn't collective support for it by socialists in this country. Their silence is loud. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think it depends on which socialists you're asking. I think socialists like us are very much in support of it. And Yasmin, our next speaker now, Yasmin Martha, welcome, from Hands of the People of Iran, is also very supportive. You do criticize, however, one of the key slogan in one of your articles, the women, life, freedom, you said is a limited slogan, and you emphasize the class nature of the hijab. Could you expand on this a little bit?
Okay, can I start by saying it's not true to say that socialists didn't support the prisoners? Some did. As much as I disagree with many of what Jeremy Corbyn has stood for, Jeremy Corbyn actually issued a statement in 1987 in the British Parliament about the execution of political prisoners in jail, and picked it up and followed it up. Later, he had other problems, but on this particular case, he did. And socialists have supported the 2019 protests against when the Iranian people rose up against subsidies. So it's not quite a lot of socialists haven't, but a lot of socialists have supported the struggles of the Iranian people. Let me start by saying that regarding the slogan, I support it as opposed to right-wing slogans, especially some put forward by monarchists, by Shah supporters, and so on, about they tried to start a slogan called Man, Country, Freedom, which means nothing. I mean, it was stupid. And I support the fact that the origins of the slogan comes from Rehoboth and the protests of the Kurdish women. So there is an echo of the Kurdish struggles. What I think is not enough is for the left to limit itself to this slogan. And in the demonstrations in Asaluye, in the workers' protest by Wahed bus workers, in the protest by teachers, we are seeing other slogans like bread, housing, freedom, or we are seeing labor, work, freedom, housing. So we do see variations of the slogan. The first 2 weeks, the woman, life, freedom was the main slogan. My criticism is that not all women are revolutionary. Not all women are against this regime. Some women support the repressive forces of the Islamic Republic. The Gasht-e-Irshad has women in it. So we can say the slogan, but then we have to explain and expand on it and say, what do we mean? There is a problem in that the protests had a large number of women for very good reasons. Women have suffered what I would call sexual apartheid in Iran in terms of the segregations, the regulations, the laws, and so on. But most importantly, they have suffered more from poverty than anybody else. Poverty because jobs insecurity as a result of neoliberal economic policies by this government and the previous government and successive governments of the Islamic Republic has made unemployment one of the main issues of the country, and women suffer from unemployment, despite the fact that they go to universities, they get degrees, then they are left with either very poorly paid jobs, insecure jobs, or no jobs. But in addition, the terrible economic conditions of the last few years, some of which has been worsened because of sanctions, but it's not just sanctions, it's corruption. It is neoliberal economic policies that have created this terrible economic situation in the country. And women have suffered far more from these, because in addition to poor employment, in addition to the fact that they have to do sometimes 2 or 3 part-time, low-paid jobs, they also have to feed a family when there are shortages of basic food, when the prices go up by the hour, not the day, they go up by the hour. The Iranian currency drops almost every day, and they have to make do with meager income to respond to what the family requires. And so it is true that in some ways, poverty has become the burden of women, in addition to sexual apartheid, all the other issues that were mentioned. So I think women have had enough, basically, 43 and more than 40, almost 44 years after this government. But it's not just women. You see people from all sections of society joining these protests. And they're joining because they are at the end of their tether. This is really the worst time for most people that they can remember. There is no horizon of a nuclear deal where there might be a promise of a better economic situation. There is no possibility of improved economic situation. The gap between the rich and the poor in Iran is worse than most of the countries neighboring the country. The Gini factor in Iran is higher than any of the developing countries in that region. If you doubt what I'm saying, go and look at the Rich Kids of Tehran website, and you will see how the relatives of the clerics, how the relatives of officials of successive governments, reformist, conservative, traditionalist, whichever faction of the Islamic Republic you want to talk about, these people are the beneficiaries of the neoliberal economic policies of this government. They have become super rich. The majority of the population are extremely poor. This is the government that came to power telling us it was going to be the government of the disinherited. Well, look at the Gini factor now. So dissatisfaction is in every section of Iranian society. The fact that you see the shouts of death to dictator from Tehran to southeast Iran, from northwest to southwest Iran, it's a clear sign that we have come to a situation where the ordinary people don't want to accept the rulers. And this is nothing to do with interventions. It has nothing to do with the role of social media. Of course, young people in Iran, as anywhere else, do use mobile phones. They know how their fellow 15-year-olds, fellow 16-year-olds, fellow 18-year-olds live. And here, the dictatorship of the Islamic Republic has made the fundamental mistakes that most dictatorships don't make, and that is intervention in the private lives of its citizens. So we are surrounded by dictators. Saudi Arabia is one. Turkey is, to a certain extent, becoming one. We have lots of other dictatorships globally. But most of these dictators know not to intervene in the private lives of their citizens, because that way they can do whatever they want. They can have their corruption. They can have their great wealth. They can do politically what they want, but the ordinary people are busy in ordinary life. This government has ruined the life of a whole generation and many generations by interfering in the private lives of these people. It intervenes about what you wear, where you go, what you eat, what you drink, when you can go out, when you can't, because there are many, many mourning days where you're supposed to be mourning imams that died many, many centuries ago. And it is these situations that has led to a conditions where I think it's intolerable for the majority of the Iranian people to accept what is going on.
Yasmin, somebody put in the chat that that sounds like a mainstream perspective that you would get on the BBC as well, which I think is misunderstanding where you're coming from politically quite drastically. But can you explain where you, for example, stand on the issue of intervention from the US and West, and how widespread is that? How many are calling for the West or the US to, support these struggles, regime change from above?
I think those of us who have stood against regime change from above for 40 years haven't got anything to answer about. We have always been accused, as Nasrin was saying, that opposing the Islamic Republic means we are supporting the US. There is no equation that tells you this. This was originally said by the Tudeh party, the official pro-Soviet Communist party in Iran. And when many of us were being arrested, they didn't support us because that was the accusation. Nowadays, this is a joke. Well, first of all, we have opposed military intervention in Iraq, in Afghanistan, everywhere else. There is no doubt that not only military intervention, but in my opinion, sanctions are not the solution to this problem. The problem we are facing can only be resolved by the people inside the country. And in fact, any intervention strengthens the hands of the Islamic Republic. Sanctions have played an important role in how some leaders within the Islamic Republic, close relatives of clerics, have made huge fortunes because they can use the black market, they can use their privileged positions to make huge sums of money. So we have opposed those. I was against the Iraq war. I spoke everywhere I could about the Iraq war. I have spoken time and time again during the Trump administration when there were serious plans about regime change. I think even the Lebanese Hezbollah invited me to speak about Trump intervention. So it's not that I have not spoken out against US intervention.
Yes, thank you, Yasmin, for clarifying. Before we bring in David Miller, who has got a different perspective on this issue, I was just going to ask you, Nasrin, what you think of this issue of, calling on Western and other governments to. They claim they support the protesters, etc. Could they play a progressive role at all?
No, I don't think America wants this regime to go. This Islamic regime is the best alternative, was the best alternative for America, and still is the best alternative for America. And the thing is, and it's very interesting. I followed the current protest from the beginning, and I haven't seen even one placard or heard one slogan in favor of the Shah or his son, or asking America to come and help us. But they say something. They say, please stay out of it. Please don't try to help us. Yeah, because people in Iran are fed up with America's intervention in countries like Iran. They remember the 1953 intervention of America to overthrow Mossadegh, and bringing back Shah, and they know all about it, about the 1979, how America helped the Islamists to take power in Iraq. So, I mean, this is not something that America would look forward to it. The thing is, America doesn't want an Iran with this uh, population that is uh, under 30, under 30-year-old, and they want secularism, they want uh, equality between men and women's rights. And actually, it was, you must know, Iranian Mujahideen, which are similar to Taliban. That Mujahideen were America's alternative for Iran. And so they threatened the Islamic regime now and then with Mujahideen, with supporting Mujahideen. But now, America can see, it's not blind, can see that people in Iran, those who are in the street, how come America can sell Mujahideen to these people? Of course, they won't take Mujahideen. So, yeah.
Thank you, comrades. We're going to bring in David Miller now. Thank you for being patient. David Miller runs the program, or is involved in the program, Palestine Declassified. Hi, David. You have quite a different perspective on what's going on in Iran at the moment. Would you like to outline it, please?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with where we've just come from, which is the rather otherworldly perspective on US intervention. It's not that the US is being called to intervene. The left should stop the US intervening. The Americans are in there from the beginning. That's why they pressed the riot button when they had the opportunity with the death of Mahsa Amini, who I see people said, referred to her being killed. There's no evidence she was killed. People argue about that, but if you look at the footage, it's perfectly clear. And if you look at the CT scans released by the hospital, that she didn't have head injuries. The notion she had head injuries which collapsed her skull such that she was able to walk in and sit down and then go over and then collapse in the police station is ridiculous. It's not just the Americans who've been involved from the very beginning through their agents, through their propaganda operatives, Masih Alinejad, who's had £600,000 from dollars from the State Department in the last few years, who was the one, incidentally, who was amongst the first to move from saying, "Oh, she had a heart attack," to saying, "Oh, well, she was murdered by the police." They've been involved from the beginning. The idea that the Americans have only done a few things like the Mujahideen calc, which they removed from the terror roster in 2012, or that they've only done a little bit of sanctions. Well, Yasmin, that to her credit, said all the stuff about what the effect of US intervention on Iran is. She talked about the economic problems, the problems of sanctions. These are people will remember, of course, won't they, that their last elections for the dictator were last June. This is a completely otherworldly account of what Iran is and what Iran is like, and it's an account which is pro-imperialist, which is in favor of imperial intervention, even though it says it's not. That it's actually that people are opposed to intervention. Now, of course, Yasmin did speak occasionally on Iraq. She's a part of an organization which was denied affiliation to the coalition for being a pro-imperialist. Oh, there's no monarchists there. I haven't seen any monarchist flags in Iran. Well, you've only got to look at Trafalgar Square. There were monarchist flags in Trafalgar Square. There was a bare-breasted Mariam Namazi from the Council of Ex-Muslims protesting along with the MEK, the Pahlavists, the people who are involved in this are people who use words like theocracy, mullahs, Islamists, all of these. Oh, I see Yasemin, even in her piece in the Weekly Worker the other day, refers to the MEK, a group which, of course, I oppose, as being a loony Islamic cult or group. Now, this is just Islamophobia. This is a secularism of the left dressed up as secularism when it really is just Islamophobia. I think we really need to move beyond this. Look, what we face here in geopolitical terms is the squashing of one of the key elements of the resistance against US imperialism in the world. The Iranian state supports the axis of resistance, and people will know what that means. That means the support of Ansar Allah and their valiant fight in Yemen, the support of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the intervention along with Hezbollah in Syria to support the regime change efforts in Syria from 2011 onwards, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And indeed, of course, the key armed factions in Iraq, all of the armed factions, that's the armed factions of Fatah, of Hamas, of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the others, supported by the Iranian government. Do we think that Palestine can be liberated without the Islamic Republic of Iran? Of course it can. This is absurd position. We want to sort of sit here and say, well, there's some class issues in Iran, and of course there are gender issues too. Sexual apartheid is an issue in Iran. Oh, yeah, maybe there is. There are issues in this country. Which country in the world is it that has the largest proportion of women graduates in science, technology, engineering, and maths? Is it Britain? Is it the US? Is it Russia or China? No, it's Iran. This is an absurd mischaracterization of what's happening in Iran.
Sorry, David, can I interrupt you briefly? You have internet issues. If you turn off your video, it might work better. Sorry, I should have said that before.
There's been an intervention from the beginning. The idea that these are popular revolutionary times in Iran is wrong. There have been much bigger demonstrations in favor of the regime. There's not been anything really on the scale of mass demonstrations. There have been some demonstrations and protests, as we've seen, but what I would also say is look what these involve. When Chris Kabu was killed by the police in Brixton the other week, what do we see? We saw a protest march, which Sky News even mistook for a tribute to the dead Queen. Did we see the slashing of police officers' throats? Did we see the burning alive of police officers? Did we see armed attacks on police stations resulting in 4 IRGC officers and 1 senior intelligence official being killed? Did we see any of that happening in this country? Of course we didn't, because what's happening in Iran is an armed insurrection from the outside, which is being directed by the US and by Israel through their proxies. Some of these proxies, of course, are Kurdish groups, including, let's be clear about this, including leftist groups. So Kamala, who's the cousin of Masa Amini, is a member of Kamala, an armed leftist group, which is a proxy for Israel and the US, and the PKK, which from where probably comes the slogan "Women, Life, and Freedom." These are leftist groups who are actually engaged in armed struggle against the Islamic Republic of Iran, with the backing of both Israel and the US. So it's very clear. If the left wants to put itself up as an anti-imperialist force in this country, then it shouldn't be siding with the imperial actions of the US and indeed of the Zionist regime just across the land strip. I mean, I think we're in a terrible position if we start to use terms like Islamist and mullahs and not have a proper understanding of what's actually going on inside Iran and the context of Iran in geopolitics.
Thanks, David. A couple of questions from me and perhaps Graham before we bring in the other comrades. I can switch the camera on. I mean, you say you've described it as a deception that Masa Amani was killed by the police, but does it matter if she, in that sense, if she had a heart attack, if she just had a heart attack and died? She was arrested by a police that arrested her for showing too much hair. That's not a really very good reason to be arrested for. I mean, does it matter? I mean, people go on the streets because they protest against this morality police. Do you think none of these protests are actually from below? Do you think none of them are normal working class people fighting for a better life?
Well, I mean, I use the phrase "push the riot button." So, of course, there are outside agitators, there are outside armed groups. Of course, there's an attempt to stoke fire, and of course, sometimes that works. But you know, I mean, people might remember a magazine in this country in the 80s called Class War, and they used to have this regular section. It wasn't my favorite journal. Yeah, they used to have this section called the Ministry of Crap Arrests. You know, is it the case that the police in this country are engaging in appropriate arrests all the time? No. Is it the case that when the police enforce the law in this country, nobody really has a problem with that? That is the case, yes. So, you know, whatever you or I might think about police is an irrelevance to this. What this is that there was an attempt to construct something out of nothing, and the nothing was the murder or killing of Massa. I mean, she wasn't murdered or killed; she died. And it's very unfortunate. But that was the spark which they used to pursue their aims. It's perfectly clear, and I think it's the same. It's a very similar thing to what happened in Syria. If you go back to 2011, when the alleged Arab Spring protests were happening in Syria, what actually we now find is that these are almost entirely armed actions from armed groups which are smuggled in at the behest of MI6, the CIA, and indeed French intelligence, and they were including those who were trained by MI6 in Libya to depose Gaddafi, and then they shifted across to try and undermine and overthrow the Assad regime. Whatever you think about the Assad regime, or indeed about the Islamic Republic of Iran, what we're seeing is an attempt at regime change.
Graham.
Well, hi, David. I'm a bit devastated, to be honest, by what you said. And I speak as someone who's totally supported your totally correct fight for academic freedom and for Palestinian rights. But I think we're operating in totally different worlds. I mean, if the Iranian state is the axis of resistance to imperialism, then I think we're in a far worse state than even I realised. I'm hardly on the kind of optimistic wing of the left. I think this is the kind of politics that has, I think, almost destroyed the left in its history. This campism, this my enemy's enemy is my friend. I'm not accusing you of this, but because it's not just you, it's way beyond you. If it was just you, I wouldn't be bothered. There's loads of good comrades on the left who have this position today on Iran and have had it in the past. It led those people on the left to support the Moscow trials against when Stalin attacked the opposition. It led them to support the invasion of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And if Iran and Syria are the bulwarks of resistance to imperialism, the bulwarks of the struggle for socialism, then let me make it clear, I don't want anything to do with this kind of struggle for socialism. There is a movement of resistance that is going on. It's led by the women. I'm not at all interested, by the way, although comrades who know more can say about the death of this poor woman. But that, as Tina said, isn't the point. There is a legitimate struggle that goes way beyond, as Yasmin said, the particulars of this murder, about the conditions suffered by the people, by the working class, by the students, by the Kurds, the Kurdish people. I'm not talking about Kurdish organizations here. And I think the first question for us is, whose side are we on? And I can hardly believe that a really good comrade like you can, in my opinion, actually end up on the wrong side of history.
Do you have a question for David?
Well, I actually had a question for Yasmin, actually, if I can just ask a question. Well, to David, I'm sure in due course you'll tell me why I'm so fundamentally wrong. But to Yasmin, you're talking about how the conditions are so impossible to suffer for the people of Iran. Where is this leading? Because some people on the left, from the, if you like, the other wing, are saying, well, this isn't just a protest, this is a revolution. I mean, what is the revolutionary potential for what is happening? And who are the real allies of who are the real allies of that struggle? And finally, could you just say something, and perhaps this will perhaps deal with some of the issues that David's raised about the conflict between imperialism and Iran and the Iranian state? Because my own impression is that it's a very limited regional conflict between the two, and that fundamentally, when it came to the crunch, imperialism supported the creation of this regime when the alternative was a working class communist revolution. Now, perhaps that's just my wrong view of history. I mean, can someone explain what is that conflict and how deep that conflict goes between Iran and imperialism?
Yasmin, please.
Okay, first of all, the allies of the protests are definitely the ordinary people of the West. I think trade unions should support these struggles, left-wing organizations should support them. And I think these protests reflect a very, in some ways, a time when we are looking at, for the first time, women being prominent in protests in the Middle East. So it is a new time, a new era in some ways. But as I said, this is to do with poverty. This is to do with basic rights. It is to do with bread issues, as simple as bread issues. Iran and imperialism is a very important issue. I think the Islamic Republic has never, ever been anti-imperialist. In fact, they get really upset if you call them anti-imperialist. They say this is a Marxist term. We're not Marxist. They were trying their best to be on the West side. It's the US that hasn't forgiven them for 1979, for the hostage taking, not the revolution. And we have seen time and time again when senior people in this regime have been close to US administration. I just mentioned a few, Iran Gate being one, the Iraq War, when Iran supported the US invasion of Iraq, their allies came to power. The occupation government in Baghdad is the best friend of Iran's Islamic Republic. Before that, in the Afghan war, when they gave maps of where the Taliban could be hit by US planes in order to ingratiate themselves to the Bush administration, and subsequently, at various occasions, it's the US that, having had no choice at the time of 1979, because their main issue was to make sure the left didn't gain any power. I'm not saying the left was at the verge of power, but the main issue was to make sure the left was decimated, was killed, was executed, was arrested. They tolerated this government. But since then, where is this? Syria is a complicated issue. I don't want to start the debate there. I have some sympathy in looking at Saudi interventions in Syria and the US's subsequent interventions. But I think to summarize Iran's anti-imperialism about Syria is ridiculous. You speak to Palestinians who are not in Islamic Jihad, they will tell you, if only for every slogan that Iran's Islamic Republic has given about Palestine, they had done something about it, we would not be where we are. So even the support for Palestine is definitely debated, is definitely questioned by secular Palestinians, by the PFLP, by whatever remains of independent people in Gaza. And I speak to lots of people on that. So this idea that Palestine can only be liberated by a country that has no respect for anyone in its own borders is a joke. It's unbelievable to say something like that. That's it. I don't think Iran's Islamic Republic has ever been anything but using slogans against US in order to make up for the fact that none of the other issues of 1979, which brought it to power, have been adhered to. There's no class equality, there is no disinherited people getting rich, nothing is left. Thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin. David, bring you back in again. Yasmin has also outlined that the regime in Iran, the government of Iran, has accepted IMF interventions and introducing wide-scale privatizations in order to get on the good side of the imperialists and to get money. Do you think? I mean, does that not show that it's not really an anti-imperialist country in your view?
Well, no, it doesn't. I mean, look, I mean, the idea that the Palestinians are not very, very close to the Islamic Republic. The key clue in Yasmin's words there, which illustrates that, is that she said secular Palestinians, by which she means secularist Palestinians, most of whom are Islamophobes. Now, if you look at the actual resistance in Palestine, Gaza, in the West Bank, the armed groups, including the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which came out of Fatah, they are at one with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they are directly supported with training, with weaponry, and everybody knows this. Go and look at their Twitter feeds. And the same is true in relation to Syria. I mean, maybe people don't know this. I mean, I know that Hamas fell out with Assad for some period over the attempted regime change in Syria, but they're not falling out anymore. If you go and look at the most recent visits of Hamas, of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to Damascus, and indeed Assad's statements that he supports all of the factions in Palestine, regardless of what's in their name, meaning whether they've got the word Islam in their name. Now, what we're seeing here is I'm afraid, a kind of secularism of the left, which can tolerate revolution only if it comes with some mild forms of religious involvement, in particular Christian involvement. When it comes to Islamic revolutions, people don't like that, and they don't like that, and they start to refer to words like Islamist. Islamist is a racist Islamophobic term dreamt up, I have to say, by the Israelis in the period between 1979 and 1984. And we shouldn't be using it on the left. We shouldn't be using terms like mullahs. We should be properly analysing the Iranian state. The idea that this is about poverty is an absolute joke. What we face is the US imperialism trying to squash the Islamic Republic of Iran because it's a real threat to US imperialism. Now, and the same is true of the resistance in Palestine. That it's a genuine threat to Zionism. And if it wasn't for the axis of resistance, by which we mean all of these organizations in all of these countries who are united. I mean, if you remember last May, and then again this year, when there were rockets coming from Gaza and there were Israeli attacks on Gaza and elsewhere, what we see is hour by hour coordination between the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hezbollah, and the umbrella for the Palestinian resistance factions in Beirut. They have an intelligence op room in Beirut, and they're practically involved in organizing operations. Now, if that is the Islamic Republic of Iran not supporting the Palestinian resistance, I don't know what support would be.
David, I mean, you said the left doesn't support Islamist revolutions. I mean, the reason for that might be because they end up killing a lot of us. I mean, the Islamic regime is torturing, imprisoning, suppressing, oppressing working class people, the students. I mean, we're not making this up. I mean, do you not see that there is a real problem in terms of, working class women's expression and problems with their rights being oppressed in Iran? Do you dispute that at all?
I think that the Western conception of individual rights is just that. It's a Western conception. It's not a conception which necessarily has anything to do with socialism. It more has to do with the way in which Western society has developed. I mean, we see actually a consumer society in the UK and the US, which is imploding upon itself through decay and corruption. And actually, no wonder that not everyone in the world thinks that's a good model to follow. Why should we follow a model which has shown itself to be deeply corrupt and to depend on the regular invasions of other countries to steal resources and to occupy land? I don't see that the idea of Western civilization, as the man said, it would be a good idea.
Oh, there's other alternatives, aren't there? I mean, we're socialists, aren't we? We're fighting for a socialist alternative. We don't fight for Iran to become a capitalist country under the leadership of the US. We're helping, we're in support with the democratic forces.
Are we fighting against US imperialism? Really?
I would think we are. Graham, go on.
Well, you say, David, that our socialism isn't about fighting just for individual rights. That's true. We fight for collective rights, but that doesn't preclude individual rights. What about the right of women to dress as they see fit? I mean, it's a very simple question. Do you support that right or don't you? Or do you not think it's important?
You think that we should support foreign intervention in a country which has a different model of women's rights than the model in the UK? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's exactly what I wasn't saying, David. I asked a simple question. Do you support the right of women to dress as they see fit? I'm very clear, like the speakers, I don't at all support Western imperialism.
There are many.
That's the question. Does our socialism include the right of individuals and collectives of women to dress as they see fit? Yes or no?
So are you asking me a question about sex work and the status of sex workers? I mean, there are many feminism in this country, question. Some of which support the sexualization of women and some of which don't support the sexualization of women. That's a complicated question. We're not talking about those kinds of currents in feminism at present.
I think we're talking about hijab. Should women have the right not to wear the hijab in Iran?
Or the right to work, or the right to divorce, or the right to have access to their children after divorce, or the right of inheritance, or many other rights.
There are many things we could say about what rights should be available in Iran, in Iraq, in the UK, and in the US. But are we advocating military action against the UK because there are significant problems of women's rights in this country, which there are? No, we're not. Of course, we're not.
Okay, but none of us are supporting, Western intervention in Iran.
We intervene in Iran. We don't intervene in the UK or Germany or France.
But none of us are saying that. None of us supporting intervention of the US.
Look at this country. The number of women who graduate in science and technology and engineering and maths compared to Iran is terrible. We should have protests in the streets because of that.
Well, we are fighting for women's liberation here as well. Of course, we're fighting against discrimination of women here, but we're talking about concretely, the hijab issue in Iran as well as Yasmin said, discrimination of women.
Why are we talking about that?
Because we're talking about what's going on in Iran tonight. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to Yasmin. I was going to ask you something that David said is that it's not about poverty, and you did touch on that. And could you perhaps explain the role of sanctions, which we also oppose, all of this on this panel, the role of sanctions, the role of IMF as well in producing a situation which at the moment has there's 40% inflation in parts as well. And there were huge demonstrations against poverty in 2018 and 2019. Could you explain how that is related to sanctions and IMF?
Yes, I would start by saying that in the 21st century, and indeed in the latter part of the 20th century, you can't be anti-imperialist and be pro-neoliberal capital, because pro-neoliberal capital makes you part of a global capitalist system that tells you you have to cut off subsidies, which the Islamic Republic has done time and time again. You have to privatize. The state that came to power in 1979 has now privatized 80% of state-owned companies with massive unemployment, with poverty for the rest of the population. Then they are proud. Successive Iranian presidents, from Ahmadinejad to Khatami to Rouhani to Raisi, are proud to say IMF praises them for being the model country of neoliberal economics. Now, to consider such an economy part of anti-imperialism is beyond me. I cannot understand the Marxist who thinks that would be anti-imperialism. And sanctions have played an important part. I am not denying it, but it's a bit like privatization. So the Shahis, the royalists, tell us, privatization in the Islamic Republic hasn't gone the right way. Only the supporters of the regime and their allies have benefited from privatization. Well, you show me a dictatorship where this hasn't happened. Of course, privatization goes that way. But sanctions have done exactly the same. Sanctions have enriched those in power. They import goods on the official rate of the dollar, and they sell it to poor Iranians whom they've made unemployed because of their bloody neoliberal privatization, because they've cut off subsidies from them. They sell those goods to Iranians on the unofficial rate of the dollar, which is 10 times, 20 times more. So why do you think the son-in-law of Ayatollah Rouhani is called Sultan of Bananas? Because he and his father import bananas to Iran and make huge sums from it. Sanctions have made them these rich people that they are. So I oppose sanctions, not just because it's a form of intervention, it's a form of siege in some ways, but also because it has the complete opposite effect of what Hillary Clinton, Blinken, all these four Secretary of States have said, targeted sanctions. They target ordinary Iranian people, impoverish ordinary Iranian people. As for military intervention, of course, no one in their right mind could support military intervention. But as Nasrin said, no one in Iran is wanting that. In fact, in Iran, people are saying, don't intervene. We don't want your support. And the left abroad is saying that. To minimize this to a couple of royalists and their idiotic spokespeople is to ignore hundreds of thousands of demonstrators and put the attention on one or two individuals, and really is to accept the US propaganda in that way.
David, do you want to come back on any of that?
Well, I mean, look, I see Tony's put a message in there about anti-imperialism as a form of anti-capitalism. It's not necessarily. Look, we're now in a geopolitical system and state of affairs where we're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And we're moving from a period of the last 20 or 30 years when the Americans have been in charge. And that power, that hegemony is dissipating. Now, in that circumstance, we have a number of powers in the world who are able to exert counter pressure against the imperialist core, again, which is the West. And those, of course, are Russia and China, but Iran is part of that. And it's part of that structurally, whether it's neoliberal, whether everything that Yasamin has said about neoliberalism in Iran is correct or not. So we are facing with that position. And the idea that supporting the resistance in Palestine is not an anti-imperialist act, what can that even mean as a form of English? I mean, it's completely crazy. So, if we want to liberate Palestine, which I, for one, do, then we have to find the way to do that. That's not going to happen by us having some more effective debates and discussions and boycotts and divestment and sanctions on Israel. It's going to come by the defeat of the Zionist regime, and that will not happen if you haven't got other regimes and organizations to support Palestinian resistance. And the Islamic Republic of Iran is a steadfast ally of the Palestinian people. We should remember that.
Thanks, David. We have invited David, and it's slightly unfair. He's by himself, but it's an important debate, and lots of lefties have that view, and we want to bring in people from the floor as well. Yasmin, did you want to say something?
I just have one word about Iran and Israel. Iran Gate. When we know how Iran accepted a deal with the US and Israel. And that really, if anyone on the Iranian left had any illusions about the Islamic Republic, I think Iran Gate killed that for the people.
Yes, I'm bringing in Tony now. I think it's really good a discussion. There's a lot of a bit of aggressiveness in the chat. I think it's an important discussion to have, and we should treat each other with respect, etc. And I think these are viewpoints we have to debate out. Tony.
Yeah, I agree with Tina. Someone's rung me, but never mind. I agree with Tina that we should treat David with respect because his viewpoint doesn't just belong to him. There are many people on the left who have exactly the same position. For example, Chris Williamson, but many others as well. Where David goes wrong is in seeing Iran as an anti-imperialist country. It isn't an anti-imperialist country. It's been forced into confrontation with imperialism because it wants a role in the region as a regional hegemon, and Israel, which is, if you like, operating on behalf of the United States, is unwilling to grant it that. But if you look at Syria, which David also said was anti-imperialist, David forgets in 1977, it was given the green light by Israel and the United States to intervene in the Lebanese civil war on the side of the phalangists in order to defeat the Lebanese national movement, who aimed to overthrow the confessional structure. So it actually was allying itself with Israel's own allies. And similarly, Iran, I mean, Yasmin has mentioned the Iran-Contra scandal, which was that Israel supplied Iran with billions of dollars of weaponry. In return, Iran provided the money that was used illicitly to fund the Contras who were fighting the Nicaraguans, who were anti-imperialists. So quite how you can reconcile that with anti-imperialism, I just don't know. But it's a wider problem because anti-imperialism is, yes, anti-capitalism. And I would say the Cuban regime is a genuinely anti-imperialist regime. The Iranian regime is an extremely reactionary regime on every single level. It has the blood of thousands of workers on its hands, and we should have no illusion. Of course, the CIA and Israel will try to intervene in the protests, but those protests are genuine. They're operating in every single province, 31 provinces of Iran. So we should not simply take our watchword, if you like, our position from a negative to what Israel says. I think that would be absolutely bankrupt, as it were. I also disagree with David to call the PKK simply an Israeli operant extension, as it were. It is a genuine organization in its own right, and it's fighting the Turkish regime, whatever caveats we may have about some of its policies. But I do think, and I stand by what I say, if you're a genuine anti-imperialist, then you must be anti-capitalist, because imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. And that's the problem with countries which are anti-imperialist, achieve national liberation. And what do? They then oppress their own peoples, becoming in essence a comprador bourgeoisie. And can I just say on the Palestine question to David, the major mistake of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and other Palestinian organizations was to believe they could rely on other Arab regimes to do their own liberation for them. They found out at a very, very heavy cost that those regimes will not support them when they're able to actually discard them. And we see that with the Abraham Accords, where a whole series of Gulf regimes recognized Israel, where the Saudis now, of course, recognize in practice Syria. They're working very closely with Israel. So I really do think, David, this is a bankrupt form of anti-imperialism. Thank you.
Okay, very respectful there. David, I've switched your video back on. It's a bit weird not to see you. I'll have to switch it off if your internet breaks down again.
Thank you, Tony. Well, I mean, look, the PKK and indeed the other Kurdish groups are effectively assets and proxies, and the same was true in of all the groups in the Syrian alleged revolution from 2011 onwards. And the former French foreign minister admitted as much just the other day. Now, I mean, I'm no doubt. I agree with some of what Tony says there. I mean, of course, I don't forget what happened in Syria in 1977, or indeed the role that powers that now find themselves in the anti-imperialist camp have played in relation to imperialism in the past. I mean, including the use in the war on terror of black sites in those countries. So, of course, these things are complicated, and of course they move with the times. But we're now in a period where that has changed. I mean, Putin has tried his best to be a mate with the West, and many people who are advising him said that he shouldn't do that and he should get a grip, but they were never going to be his friends. And we found that out perhaps too late. So, we're now in a different political period in history. The Abraham Accords, as Tony quite correctly says, have taken a whole string of Arab governments, including the Saudis, who, of course, as Tony says, now coordinate very closely with Israelis, in particular through the Emiratis in Dubai. So yes, these are of course genuine issues, but we actually have a fight going on at present with the axis of resistance. Do people think that it was the US or the UK or the French who defeated ISIS in Iraq and Syria? Do people think that? Or do they know that it was Soleimani who did that? The Iranian regime, as you would be calling it in this discussion, did that. And the world, not just this country, not just the left, the world owes Iran a debt for the defeat of ISIS. I mean, a truly world historical feat that was. And that's where we are now. Call that not anti-imperialist if you like, and call it if you like to say they were forced into it. Fine, their backs were against the wall. That's fine. I'll have them on my side. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Yasmin or Nazrin, if you want to come in, just if you could lift your hand and I'll bring you in. There's a few people on in the audience, and we want to finish by 8:30. So if you could keep it to a couple of minutes, thank you. Anne McShane.
Okay, all right, thank you. No, I'm finding the discussion really interesting, and actually it's quite good to have an argument about this question rather than people be afraid to disagree or upsetting each other, because this is such an important question. And because our role as socialists or communists outside Iran is extremely important. We may be very weak in number, and we definitely are, but us taking a principled stand makes a difference, I believe, to what Iranians believe to be the case about socialists internationally. If they see us take a stand, then I think that gives them confidence and an awareness of the fact that there is an alternative to the United States or European imperialism. Anyway, in terms of the question of pro-imperialism, or it being the case that if you oppose the Iranian state, you are connected up immediately with the United States. I began a campaign here in Ireland in 2009, also called Hands Off the People of Iran. And we had those arguments again and again. And I agree that I think that it can be a difficult question. And I do know that Yasmina is somebody who's been really very cautious all the time to make sure that she knows where her sources are coming from with their stories, because it is clearly the case that the United States is really going to be enthusiastic about using the opportunity to change the regime. So it's a dangerous situation. And my final question, really, I suppose, is to Yasmina. I think maybe when you came back on the question of the role of women, you might have kind of emphasized one issue above another. It seems to me, looking at it, that working class women are playing the role that they have played in so many struggles. So they're fighting both for their rights as women to express themselves, to have the right to decide what they wear, but also their rights as workers. And that's what makes it so interesting and so important for us to support those democratic questions, and for the men in Iran to take up their struggle. And they do seem to be, from the footage I've seen, many men are taking up the rights of women and defending them. And that's just absolutely marvelous. That's just so fantastic, because when the working class comes together in that way, I think it is a very powerful force. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks. I suggest I take the two other speakers from the floor and then give each of you about 5 minutes or so to come back. Mike, please.
Thanks, Tina. So I welcome the debate as well. And history, comrades, it's not a spectator sport. As we know, standing aside when people mobilise is to stand with the oppressor against the oppressed at all times. And during any domestic uprising, particularly when the hegemony, the integrity of any one state is under threat, of course, there are competing state actors. But to use that, that simple observation as a pretext for withdrawing our support, or worse, throwing our weight behind a theocratic regime such as the Iranian regime, is bewildering to me. It seems to show anyway a bewildering moral and political relativism at large on the left, because by doing so, we don't only fail in our duties, a fundamental duty of the left to extend the hand of solidarity to people in struggle around the world. By abandoning the people of Iran, we invite the very outcome that David and others are claiming to fear. By withdrawing what solidarity we can muster and leaving the field, we leave it that much more open to the machinations of Western imperialism. All uprisings, comrades, are messy and complicated. They attract multiple protagonists. If we had acted on the logic of some of the contributions tonight, we wouldn't have supported the October Revolution because it might have favoured the German state. We wouldn't have associated ourselves with anti-colonial struggles because Stalinism was invested in some of those. It seems to me to be a fundamental obligation of serious socialists, serious internationalists, to identify the most progressive, the most class-based elements of any uprising and to offer them our full support. And while I absolutely agree with Anne, with Tina and others that this is an important and necessary discussion, and I think it's another commendable evening for Redline TV to platform, I have been surprised at some of the contributions.
Thanks, Mike. Ian, as the last speaker, and then we bring the main speakers back. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, just to start off by saying where I'm coming from, I was one of the Stop the War, even at that time, SWP activists that Yasmin and Tina and maybe some other people on the call would have been very critical of 10 odd years ago at the start of the nuclear standoff. But on this occasion, I certainly agree with them. I see where David's coming from, the main enemy being at home as part of our tradition. We shouldn't be investing in regime change. We should be exposing the West. And of course, the West will be trying to get an in on this. But I think we don't do ourselves any favors by going down rabbit holes of saying there aren't internal causes for this. I think the idea they could just push literally a button for the riots doesn't really pass Occam's razor, and neither does relying on what the police have said about this woman just happened to die when she was in custody, as opposed to her parents who say she didn't have an underlying condition. But either way, if this was something that never happens other than this, or else was a fluke event, then it probably wouldn't have lit the tinderbox to this extent, even if there were other dark forces amplifying it for reasons of the nuclear standoff, where I would say we have to get our knee off Iran's neck, but that's to allow Iran better to develop itself and solve its own contradictions. I think it's being put through in this 20-year confrontation now almost over the nukes, this extreme contradiction of the sanctions on the one hand, and this is what they're designed to do, tearing the society apart, and a very capitalist regime with a lot of corruption and totally unnecessary misogyny thrown in there too, is contributing to that, and at the same time rallying around the flag, of course, because of the imperialist crosshairs. Of course, Iran's role in the Middle East in recent years has been to fight against some of the more sectarian Islamist forces, whether that's in Syria, in Yemen. So I think some of the stuff about secularism equals Islamophobia, when it was the majority position historically in the Palestine movement as well, as I was a bit surprised at you saying that. And I think this particular protest movement, we'll see where it ends up. But I must say, compared to 2009, where there were debates about was the election rigged, or was it actually as the polls predicted, and the protesters were very disappointed in the result, then so were the people on January the 6th last year, or King Cyrus Day, monarchist protests, or socioeconomic protests that then got hijacked by forces saying death to Hezbollah, we don't care about Gaza. compared to all of that, this one seems to be the most politically healthy opposition to have emerged in Iran. And given the prominence of feminism and women's rights in it, would be harder, I think, for Saudi misogynistic Wahhabis to hijack in any way. In fact, might even I'll try and end on a positive note now. Could it possibly even spill over into Saudi Arabia, where the women's oppression is even worse?
Okay, David. David has a lot to say on that, I think. Okay, David, I'll start with you, and you might want to comment later again. So
thank you, comrade. It's a long time since I've had a chat with you. So it's not going to spill over into Saudi Arabia because the Saudis are involved, and you can see that from the propaganda, from their propaganda channel, which beams its wares into Iran, along with the other propaganda channels, which are helping to foment the riots and protests in Iran. Of course, those are of course the troll farm of the MEK in Albania, which of course is held under NATO auspices, and then of course there are all sorts of other monarchist channels which have obscure funding regimes, which even Wikipedia will tell you if you care to look it up. Now, so of course this is not going to spill over into the Saudi context, and the Saudis are involved, and there have been ISIS elements infiltrating Iran as part of this process. Where is it that we think the feminist movement in Iran got the men with the guns to attack the police stations? Do we think that somehow they're in the act of cutting their hair and ripping off their hijabs themselves? And let's not forget there were many other women whose hijabs were ripped off by the protesters. Itself a pretty Islamophobic state of affairs. Where did these feminists get these men with guns? Where did they come from? Are these somehow separate from the protests? Are they the 24 police, Basiji and IRGC officers who've been killed in the protests, which is, according to the stats that you used earlier in the program, around about an eighth of the people who've been killed. But the organization which gives the stats doesn't have any police officers killed in the protests so far. They only have protesters killed by the forces of the state. So we have a massive propaganda war going on over this. The Saudis are on the other side of it, and you know, if you want to support women's rights in Iran, if you think that a Western model of freedom of choice over the hijab is a good thing, well, the only way to get that without destroying Iran is to say, let's remove the sanctions, let Iran develop and see how modernization operates in the context where there is not mass poverty, as Yasmin has been saying. And poverty doesn't all come from the sanctions, but a lot of it, 70% or so of it does. So, you know, if you want to see Iran reformed in a way which perhaps to the Western sensibility or the Western leftist sensibility, or even the Iranian leftist sensibility would approve of, well, you're not going to do that by having protests which are essentially not hijacked, but created by outside forces. So that's what I would say. You know, of course, there are many people in Iran who are genuine, who have been lied to about Mahsa Amini, who have been told all sorts of stories about what's happening in Iran, and protests have sparked up. But many of them are genuine. Even the Iranian leadership itself says that. So, you know, I'm not saying that everyone has been infiltrated by the West, but many of them have, and many of the actors have. Where else did the guns come from? Are the guns held by Kamala or by the PKK or by the MEK just randomly in Isfahan or Qom or wherever? No, they're not. Of course not. This is an outside intervention, and we should recognise that. If none of the people on the other side of the argument from me can account for any of this, well, what does that say? All I hear from the other side is, oh, there's all these protesters and bad things have happened to them. Well, you know, that's not a proper account of what's happened.
Thanks, David. Nazrin, I suggest I bring you in now.
David, I find your views insulting to women in Iran. Women don't need men with guns to defend them. They can defend themselves. Women started this revolution. They don't need men with guns. And I hope the regime haven't heard your views. Otherwise, they would go and arrest Mahsa's, Amini's families, accusing them of being in relation with Komele. And the sentence for that is execution. Now, I'm sorry, but the regime says exactly the same things about women uprising, about all different things about this revolution. Now I wonder, perhaps the regime is a socialist regime, because you call yourself socialist. I'm sorry, I don't want to pick on you, but you call yourself socialist and you're defending a regime that calls itself Islamist. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazrin. David, you're free to come in briefly.
Sorry, just to say that it doesn't call itself Islamist. I mean, comrades are perhaps understandably confused about this matter, right? An Islamic regime is not the same thing as an Islamist regime. The term Islamist was never in the vocabulary until the 1980s. It was dreamt up as a term to denote political Islam in all its varieties. So it's a term which is used to denounce the involvement of Islam in the politics of people wherever they are in the world. And it lumps together the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwani people, it lumps together the Salafists and Wahhabists, and it lumps together, of course, Shia, Islam, and the government in Iran. This is a term which is racist, and which is used to say that's bad Muslims. Now, they did this so that they could say there was a specific threat in the world once the Soviet Union was on its way out, and that it was the biggest threat to civilization. It was the Islamic threat, right? And that's what when they came up with the term Islamic terrorism. That's what international terrorism means after about 1986, 87. This is a term dreamt up by the Israelis. It's a racist term, and we shouldn't use it on the left. Islamist is a racist term. You can talk about political Islam. You can talk about Muslims using religion to guide their politics. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with Christians using their religion to guide their politics? Yes, people might be secularists. Do you think there would have been a civil rights process and movement in the US if it wasn't for the role of the black churches? Of course not. Religion has a legitimate role in politics, and people are able to use that to guide their politics. There's nothing wrong with that. If you have a position which says that's completely wrong, well, then they advance that argument. But really, if you want to remove religions from I mean, the people quote the opium of the masses, right? And of course, they sometimes forget, not always, sometimes forget to quote the next line, the heart of a heartless world. Now, I'm not religious myself, but what is wrong with people using their religion as a guide to political action, unless it is action which we can say is wrong on other grounds? Let's stop this. Let's stop the idea that regimes and movements which use Islam as a guide for their action are somehow wrong because they're Islamic. And that's effectively what we're saying.
Yasmin.
It's not about secularism and Islam. It's about capitalism, a neoliberal capitalist country, a reactionary country, and the rest of the population in that country. And to take it into Islamophobia about people like me who've argued against Islamophobics for most of my life is really an insult, adding insult to injury. Women with hijab, with headscarf, have supported the demonstrations. They are on these demonstrations saying, I want to keep my hijab, but I support my sisters, my daughters, who don't want to wear a hijab. And no one is talking about banning the hijab in Iran, except idiots outside, monarchists or idiots. What we are talking about is the freedom to choose what you want and what you wear. And that's a basic, I would have thought, a basic freedom. It is true that women were the first in this demonstration. The fact that the working class, as Anne pointed out, is joining a protest started by women is unique in the Middle East. In the Middle East, most of the time people complain, where are the women in the protest? Where are the women in the demonstration? This is unique. And as I try to argue, it's because poverty has become feminine in Iran. Women have suffered more from poverty. So there is a direct relationship with this. I'm not saying that women will lead a class revolution. I'm saying the working class will lead the revolution. But the fact that women are playing such a prominent role is very important. As for US-Saudi plans are clear. They want to divide Iran into small countries, nationalities. That's why they have been prompting Baluchis, Ahvazis, Kurds to fight, to create a fight between these nations and the central government. In fact, these protests have proved the exact opposite. There is, as a number of websites inside Iran, leftist websites inside Iran keep writing, we are in a post-nationalist state. The Baluchis demonstrated for the Kurds. The people in Tehran demonstrated for the Kurds. The Azeris, who have a history of being the neighboring province to Kurdistan, having fought with the Kurds, supported the Kurds. So it's really only Saudis who talk about these nationalist fights, and they haven't got anywhere. And these protests were in fact a proof that that will not go. That scenario is not going to work. I have my own arguments about this, but let's leave that. The presence of various Kurdish groups, about which I have probably written more than you, David, some of which are dubious. And I think, yes, the idea of creating the copy of Iraqi Kurdistan in Iran is recipe for disaster, is to strengthen Israel, is to create another corrupt little state with no future. But to reduce this to a Saudi plot with Kumele is really not to see the forest for a branch of a tree. It's not even a tree. It's not to see a huge protest by hundreds of thousands of people all over the country, irrespective of their Kurdish or non-Kurdish nationality. And nobody in Iran talks about Kumele. It's only the government that talks about Kumele. Nobody else is thinking this is a plot by Kumele. And even in terms of Kumele, it's not just Kumele. Kumele is a small split from a larger organization called the Communist Party of Iran, which has its own Kurdish organization. And at the same time as Kumele has at times been, I agree, pro-US, the main branch of Kumele, which most Iranians know about, hasn't done this, has constantly opposed US interventions in the region, and doesn't support the Kurdish entity in Iraq. So this is again a falsification of real facts in order to come up with unjustifiable defense of the Islamic Republic. My only comment is, this is not an anti-imperialist government. It will not, it was forced into a position in Syria. It had its, yes, I have said it, it had to fight there because ISIS was set up, was helped by Saudis to attack Iran. That is true. But beyond that, to give it any credibility beyond that, is to turn the world upside down and to see it from a completely misguided view. Thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin. There were lots of people in the chat actually supportive of what David said. Unfortunately, none of them wanted to speak. But David, if you want to say something again, please, you can have another couple of minutes.
Do you want to start my video, or is it?
I'll ask you to start it. Okay, maybe it works this time.
Thanks. I mean, look, we have a different view on this. Yes, of course, there are complex questions about the Kurds. The point I was making about Kamala was that Masa Amini's cousin is a Kamala fighter, and he was on Sky News talking about the protests. So that's, you know, that's what I was talking about there. I was simply making a conjecture. So I'm not making any allegations. Now, look, the role of the Saudis and indeed of the Israelis and the Americans. Let's not forget MI6's role, which has been little discussed so far, is to foment revolution in Iran. As Yasamin says, yes, they want a series of small nations. They want the next big thing, which the left will be invited to support, will be the Balochi people's big struggle against their oppressors. Look, we're in danger of falling for every ruse that the imperialists put out for us to lap up. And of course, in those circumstances, people on the left sometimes will get caught up in that. Now, people on the left in this country will get caught up in that because, we're not the best at international issues. But people on the left in Iran, they had a very concrete material. Blame them for their suspicions and for their lack of wanting to actually see this in a bigger geopolitical context. I don't blame them for that, but that really we have a different conception of how things operate in the world. I'm trying to think of this in a bigger geopolitical context. I put a thing in the chat about Tony's comment. He said that and this plays to Yasamin as well, about the Iran not being an anti-imperialist nation. They were forced into the position that the Iranians would drop the Palestinians. Well, the people of Palestine are the ones who are the author of their self-determination. I would ask people on the left in this country to ask Palestinians what they think about the role of Iran, and indeed the role of Hezbollah, of the Iraqis, of the Syrian government, and indeed also Ansarullah, who in Yemen, who despite the oppression and disgraceful assault on the people that it's been by the Saudis, supported of course by the US and the UK, have even offered their support to the people of Palestine. I mean, that's an extraordinary amount of solidarity. I wish we had an organization in this country which was able to give such direct support to the Palestinians. We don't, and we should have some humility before the real experiences of the people of Palestine and where they think their revolution is going. So, I think ask the people in Palestine about what they think. And I would say the same about Iran. Ask the people in Iran. And I suspect that if you ask the people in Iran, and we can argue about this, you would find a different answer to the answer given by the two comrades who have given their views this evening. And that's because they have a different view, a view which is a minority in Iran. So, I think the question of self-determination cuts both ways. And we should be asking people in Iran and in Palestine what they think is the best way forward.
Thank you, David. I believe both Nazrin and Yasmin are in touch with quite a lot of Iranians, so I would question. Good. I would question. So I would question that they don't know what's going on, or that that's my minority view. But we're not there. I think for us, here in Britain, we've had people criticizing that we are discussing the issue of Iran and we shouldn't be meddling. It's none of our business, which I think is exactly the wrong approach. And would Iranians discuss the Starmer government? Probably. Why not? If it all depends. And they probably discussed Corbyn, and they know they're discussing hands of the people of Iran, because it's an organization, for example, that has been giving concrete support and active support to workers on strike and to students on strike, etc. So I think for us, it's been a tense discussion, but I'm very glad that David came along and stood in for a position that is actually quite widespread on the left. I don't agree with it, but I think it's important to discuss these issues. And thank you very much, Yasmin and Nazrin, for joining us. I think from the position of Redline TV, we oppose the theocracy, we oppose Western imperialism, and we stand clearly against any attempts of regime change from above, which includes sanctions, which includes the IMF interventions, etc., which we must oppose on the left. And it's not meddling. It is, as we said throughout the sessions, we're internationalists. Socialists are internationalists. We believe in international revolution. Otherwise, something like socialism can never happen. So we need to know what's going on with our sisters and brothers in Iran, and that's what we should look at them, that they are sisters and brothers fighting for democracy, etc. Comrades, next week we'll be discussing this issue a bit more with comrades in the audience, so there's more time to discuss some issues further, and hopefully Nazrin, David and Yasmin have time to join us again. I think we only touched on some of these issues, but it goes to the heart very much of what kind of socialism we're fighting for. And it touches, of course, of the situation in Iran, in Russia and Ukraine, and all of those issues as well, which probably come up next week. Thank you, comrades, for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you next week.